The year is 1971. Things are a very, very different time. The fight for civil rights was going strong. Walt Disney just opened his first Disney-themed resort in Orlando, Florida, and there were daily rally and protests against the Vietnam War. The biggest bands in the world were The Who, Rolling Stones, Beach Boys, as well as Led Zeppelin. The media named the man Dan Cooper after he managed to hijack a plane and escape with $200,000. Nonetheless, one of the biggest and largest events to be introduced in 71 was the war on drugs. This was a term coined by Richard Nixon in a statement to the public where he announced that illicit drugs were public enemy number one.
Let's take a look, shall we?
To the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
He then says he will give $500 million, which is nearly $4 billion today, towards enforcement, and gave the Bureau of Narcotics $350 million, or a little under $2.5 billion for today's inflation. He then furthers his statement by announcing an all-out defensive to defeat the enemy that is drugs. Now, as brave and courageous as Nixon's attempted to be, of course all this was just a stunt to gain popularity with voters. However, it also consisted of a dark secret as well, as this announcement would lead to a mass incarceration of African Americans. Despite most history books announcing that the war on drugs began in 1971, when Nixon made his infamous speech, it dates much further back, at least in places such as Canada. Believe it or not, in Canada and parts of the States, the war on drugs began at the very start of the 20th century. To give some context, similarly to the 1970s, the start of the 1900s was a very different time. Dissimilarly to today, though, during this era, most did not see harder drugs as much of a threat to the individual's well-being. Well, to most individuals, it was not seen as a threat. There's one group known as the reformists, right? They absolutely despise drugs or really any non-biblical form of pleasure. The reformists mainly consisted of women's and church groups who believed that morality and hard work were essential to success. By the way, this was also the group that demanded prohibition in the 1920s. Despite this, the reformists did do some good, as they fought for better economic as well as social conditions, which in doing so helped spark off the early women's suffrage movement. But of course, since this group's ideologies are based off Christian beliefs, they're going to have some, shall we say, outdated opinions. One of these being that white Christian people are better than everyone else, leading to them not being huge fans of immigrant culture. This brings me back to immigrants. Similarly to many places in history, the backbone of Canada relies on hard, cheap immigrant work. These immigrants would travel to Canada in order to secure a better life for themselves and their families. However, when they arrived, they often found themselves being seen by others as lesser, dirtier people, resulting in most immigrants being employed by male white capitalists who paid them little amounts of money to do dangerous jobs. Regardless, as terrible as these conditions were, they are sometimes better than their land of origin. Furthermore, many of these immigrants often brought over commodities from back home. One of these commodities happens to be drugs. This caught the eyes of the capitalists, who began to fear that the drugs may be used on the job, in turn slowing production, or even worse, could be sold to make money, meaning that the employee would not need to work for the capitalist anymore, as they now had a much easier and safer means of income. Moreover, the reformists began to recognize these drugs as well, fearing that they could be sold to white people, which would in turn affect their purity. This led to multiple bans on a variety of drugs, not because they were thought as dangerous, but because they were associated with a different non-white community. An early example of this was with the Chinese. Canada saw a mass immigration of Chinese throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. These Chinese brought over the drug opium with them, creating an association between the two. People feared pure white women would begin using opium and start having kids with the Chinese. Eventually, this led to opium being banned in 1908, and carrying it was considered one of the worst charges, only surpassed by assault and murder. After its ban, police would frequently target and then search Chinese men for opium, which in turn kept them in their place as cheap, lesser workers. Fast forward 70-ish years, and the cycle repeats with Nixon's war on drugs. Now, as terrible as a leader as well as a person that Richard Nixon was, when it came to the war on drugs, he was somewhat considerate with spending money on both law enforcement as well as treatment for those who are addicted, meaning that at least a little good was coming out of the war on drugs. This was not the case, though, for Ronald Reagan, who would emerge as president only 6 years later. Due to Reagan not being the best with the economy, he ended up creating a lot of homelessness and unemployment between people, right? Henceforth, this led to social and economic issues, resulting in an increased use of drugs. Furthermore, those of color found it very difficult to find employment, resulting in them turning to illegal means such as drug sales to make $1 or $2. To combat this, Reagan decided to redirect funding from drug treatment and research into drug enforcement. What's worse is the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which demanded that you receive 5 years in prison with no parole with the sale of 100 grams of heroin, 100 kilograms of marijuana, and 10 kilograms of meth. Most significantly, however, was that you would receive a 5-year minimum for selling 5 grams of crack or 500 grams of powder cocaine. Why this is so momentous compared to the other drug laws was that crack was commonly associated with African American communities, while powder cocaine was associated with Caucasians, making it much more difficult to be arrested for drug sales if you were white. All this info can be reflected on the state of Florida, which saw drugs-related charges increase by 245% from 1980 to 1990, while the admission for drug offenses grew 460%. Crack was also quoted the problem of the year, leading to police mainly targeting African Americans, resulting in drug arrests for African Americans to increase by 170% and only 21% for white people. Furthermore, by 1990, prison admissions increased twofold for whites and eightfold for African Americans. Though not as known as the States, Canada also encountered its own war on drugs throughout the 1980s. Similarly to many politicians, while Brian Mulroney was undergoing a scandal, he announced that drug abuse had become an epidemic in Canada. This is somewhat ironic, as the numbers say that both drug use as well as arrests have been declining in Canada since 1979. Despite Mulroney's odd decision to call for a drug epidemic, he at least splits the drug fighting fund more effectively, as he dedicates 70% of the funding to treatment and prevention, while the other 30% goes to enforcement. Unfortunately, this does not last, as in 1988 he shifts the funding back to enforcement in order to follow America. Overall, all this cash spent on the war on drugs does not really do anything, and instead only really put more weight on an already overburdened prison system, as well as enforces the racist stigma that drugs are associated with people of color. This brings us to today, which presents the question, did the war on drugs actually have any results? Well, this question is definitely a yes, as there are certainly results. However, these results didn't do much good, as they essentially gave the police more power when it came to arrests related to drugs. Furthermore, the war on drugs really had no effect on actual drug use. However, it did have an impact on its secondary target, which was minorities. The war on drugs made sure that the system was working effectively by heavily targeting communities of color such as African Americans. Due to the war on drugs, African Americans are now over 5 times as likely to be incarcerated in Ontario compared to white people. Furthermore, in the States, they make up over 44% of the prison system despite being only 12% of the population. One of the key culprits to this was the war on drugs, as it created more policing in low-income neighborhoods where drugs were assumed to be sold and in which communities of color are often associated with. Overall, this gave police an excuse to profile as well as target African Americans, which in turn led to a higher likelihood of their arrest, similarly to the Chinese in my example from 1908. Now, as bad as it gets worse. All these essentially innocent members of society going to jail can lead to many side effects, such as generational incarceration trauma, which is when a child's parent is arrested, leading to them being down one provider as well as a role model. This results in them firstly growing up without a parent, and secondly, their other caretakers forced to work more jobs in order to support their family. Later, this can lead to mental health issues, which can then lead them to get into drugs, which can then place them in more poverty as well, which furthers the amount of attention they are already receiving from the police, resulting in the cycle repeating. By now, you can probably see how effed up the war on drugs is. Despite its name actually sounding like its ultimate intent is to help society, it honestly made things a lot worse, especially for communities of color. Luckily, the war on drugs seems to be a lot less relevant today than it was 30 years ago. Furthermore, certain restrictions have now been enacted, such as the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, where Barack Obama made it illegal for one to be in possession of 0.5 grams of both crack and powder cocaine. Regardless, much still needs to be done to reverse the effects created by the war on drugs. This can be done in many ways. However, a good place to start would be to educate yourself, but more importantly, others on the subject. Personally, I remember while growing up, whenever a class discussed drug usage, a lot of the imagery consisted of African Americans being homeless or using drugs. Furthermore, I recall many stories frequently involving a person of color sharing their story, which unintentionally created an image in my head that communities of color are often associated with drug usage. It wasn't until I was older and began to realize that this is not true and that anyone is at risk of becoming addicted to a substance. Regardless, this does not mean that white people are profiled for drugs more frequently than African Americans today. Speaking of, a good way to stop this is to increase the discretion that a police officer has to stop someone. By this, I mean that there are only so many ways that a police officer can stop you if they're suspicious of something. This discretion is often reinforced by stereotypes. So if we can train police officers to be perceptive of larger realistic threats and not single out smaller stereotypical threats, there's a chance we could stop common racial profiling. Furthermore, to finally end the constant cycle of poverty, we can donate or volunteer at charities which support Black youth such as Black Lives Matter Canada, Big Brothers/Sisters, Junior Achievement, Eva's Initiative, and so many others. A few dollars can really help someone facing issues such as generational incarceration trauma, especially in today's economic climate. Finally, I just want to briefly discuss how we can actually end the war on drugs instead of using it to target minority groups. For starters, a good way to end addiction is to legalize or pharmaceutically prescribe minor drugs. We've already started doing this with marijuana. This has made it available in safe places instead of receiving it from the street where it could potentially be laced with another drug. Furthermore, we can erect more permanent safe injection facilities. Again, we are on our way with this one as London recently opened its first injection facility earlier this year. Speaking of injection, another way to combat the unsafety of drugs is a safe syringe program to reduce the amount of shared or reused needles, as these can lead to disease as well as greater addiction. Finally, and most importantly, we could spend some of the budget we use on drug enforcement, which in 2020 was about 10 billion, on drug prevention, which had a budget for about 300 million. So, overall, I hope you learned something in this video, whether it be about the secret motive about the war on drugs, or just ways to help reverse its effects. Either way, I just want to say thanks for watching and have a great, wonderful rest of your day.